Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 8 in our theories course where we are talking about collaborative language systems. This is an approach that I like to implement in my therapy. The concept of generative conversation, as well as like you unusual enough comments are just a couple of things that I use. Um, but yeah, let's get into it. So, Harleen Anderson, Dr. Anderson is one of the creators of collaborative language systems. So she talks, this is a quote that she has about it. I think of my approach to therapy as a philosophy of therapy rather than a theory or model. Philosophy focuses on questions about ordinary life, self-identity, relationships, mind, and knowledge. It involves ongoing analysis, inquiry, and reflection. So again, like I talked about in one of the earlier lectures in this course, that many of these postmodern approaches can feel a little bit frustrating because they don't have necessarily a format that is as straightforward as some of the approaches that you learned in Theories 1. So I do encourage you to think about this as a philosophy, as a positionality. So, we'll be learning about narrative a little bit in a couple of weeks, next week, maybe. We'll be covering that for a couple of weeks. But just giving you a little primer about how the two of these kind of dance together. So, both collaborative language systems and narrative approaches place importance on power. Like many of the approaches in this semester. They value client therapist relationships and systems that are more egalitarian and less hierarchical. They are both therapies that place emphasis on the client therapist relationship. Collaborative therapists espouse that clients are the expert of their lives and the therapist is in a not knowing position regarding it. Whereas narrative therapists are experts in helping clients achieve preferred stories and living them. Collaborative therapists favor a process of mutual inquiry and are not invested in a content outcome. They view themselves as walking alongside their client toward an unknown destination of new meaning and action. And narrative therapists favor a process that leads to preferred stories and people being able to live these preferred stories. Their role is like a narrator or editor or a narrative editor. They are careful to be public and transparent about their views and biases. We'll talk a little bit about this about being public. And then, dissimilarly, narrative therapy holds an agenda to liberate people from constraining or oppressive dominant narratives, whereas collaborative therapists pay attention to these narratives when the client thinks it is important. So, similar in many ways, different in some of the kind of goals. All right, so this approach, as you know, is anchored in postmodernism. So here you're maintaining a skepticism of truth, of uh, of what has been internalized and ways that you may challenge this. It eludes generalization. So you're looking at specifics, you're looking at examples in order to have a more local knowledge. Like so in the bottom left, privileging local knowledge. Knowledge is an iterative social process, or sorry, interactive and iterative in many ways. So this is with this social constructivism that knowledge is created by culture, by community. Language is a creative social process. That's why language is such a centralized component of these postmodern approaches. And language and knowledge are both transforming. All right, so Harleen Anderson, she's a psychologist, and Harry Gulishian, he is a theologian. Together, they co-created collaborative language systems. They have said that it is more of a philosophy of therapy rather than a model or theory. It's a way of being in relation with others. So I have several videos embedded in this lecture. I will show some of them, actually, most of them. This is really the only one that I'm not going to show you because it's about an hour long. So feel free to go into the drive as you access this lecture and take a look at Dr. Anderson talking about her philosophical stance, talking about some principles with this approach. And she also does a supervision session. So it's useful. Okay, so some goals of CLS is one is self-agency. Therapists see their role as participating in a process that maximizes the opportunities for agency to emerge in clients. So this is where this very curious, not knowing stance is very important. There's a goal of transformation. You emphasize that some original aspects remain while other aspects are added or diminished. So this is really talking about their story, their perspective, that maybe there are some parts of that that are useful, that can be helpful moving forward, and maybe there are some parts that need some tweaking. So clients' narrative of self-identity, who they tell themselves they are, that's what self-identity is transformed through the dialogical process, talking, opening new opportunities or possibilities for meaning relating to others and future action. So a transformation not only in your sense of self, but also in your relationships, and then collaboratively setting goals. Goals are constructed collaboratively with clients using their everyday language. So, collaborative language systems is really about not using jargon, using language that's accessible, using language that is initiated by the client. So, similar to the feminist approach, goals are collaboratively constructed. That the client is like a co-pilot in this process. So, key concepts of this approach: not knowing, avoiding pre knowing or assuming. Like I said in my earlier, I think the lecture on postmodernism, we don't not know anything. It's not that kind of not knowing. It's not like I'm going to throw away all my training and I'm just going to pretend like this is my first day on the planet. I just happen to know how to speak. So it's about not coming in with assumptions about what the client should do, how they should proceed. It is also really honoring their perspective, their theories, their approaches, and being really curious about that, and inviting more conversation about it. So you're viewing the client's knowledge as equally valid to your own. You don't know better than the client. And if you think you do, you should check yourself. They both of these approaches, the not knowing and knowing with, they require that the therapist ask what on the surface appears as either obvious or trivial questions. So this might be something like, um, like this, maybe the client says something like, the state of the world is really scary right now. And some of us may feel inclined to just agree, um, so that they look informed, that they are kind of like joining with the client here. You would ask something like, what about the state of the world is scary to you? Even though like it may be what's all over the news or something like that, that you are asking questions for clarity, because many times we don't ask these clarifying questions, and it removes an opportunity from the client to hear a reflection. So this is another thing about these approaches that we're learning this semester, is the power of language, and then the power of putting to words what's been in your brain and hearing them, and then having another person hear them. So please don't underestimate the power of just having space to talk about what's in your head. So when clients begin to explore alongside the counselor, or therapist, the ideas, experiences, and influences that led to the perception of the problem, they often hear themselves saying things they've never told anyone before. So again, that's the power of just hearing your thoughts that have been swirling around in your head. So, a guiding principle of this approach is to facilitate collaborative relationships with generative. So, it means like generative means generating new ideas, again, new perspectives, a new experience of the words, a two-way dialogical conversation, regardless of topic and participant. So, understandings, the thought is that understandings evolve through dialogue by allowing for new thoughts, feelings, and actions. So, this may be something that the person has talked about before, but they haven't talked about it with you. They haven't had you as kind of a co journeyer on this path. In the end, the client may not feel that the problem was solved as much as dissolved. I mean, I'm sure many of you can relate to this of like sometimes it just feels better to get something off your chest, to have a space where you are validated, heard, seen, like maybe nothing tangibly really has changed, but just allowing that to no longer be front and center, like on your heart, in your head. So, your role and expertise during the in session process, the therapist is considered to have the greater expertise, meaning that the therapist is responsible for ensuring that an effective and respectful dialogical conversation is conducted. So, again, we are the experts in the process of therapy. The therapist, is responsible for the quality of the dialogue, relying on the generative quality of conversation to support client transformation rather than the therapist dictating the content, direction, and outcome of the conversation. We'll talk more about how to do this, and you'll hear Dr. Anderson talk about how she does this as well. Okay, so the therapeutic relationship, it's a philosophical stance. It's a way of being with your client, a way of being curious, engaging in generative conversation, being public, and we'll talk about all of these things. We are conventional partners, so we have a withness. We are with our clients in their journey alongside, again, sharing maybe some thoughts that we have and being explicit that they're thoughts that we have. You are curious in your positionality. Uh, this again, the art of not knowing. So you're working to ask appropriate questions. You are believing in both your expertise as the therapist as well as the client's expertise in their own life. You use everyday, ordinary language, and then you have both inner and outer talk that I'll talk about in a few slides. All right, so first, the concept of not knowing. We're going to cover this in quite a bit of detail here. Okay, so not knowing, this is a quote. Not knowing requires that our understandings, explanations, and interpretations in therapy not be limited by prior experiences or theoretically formed truths and knowledge. This description of the not knowing position is influenced by hermeneutic and interpretive theories. These are some research approaches and philosophical approaches, and the related concepts of social constructionism, language, and narrative. This hermeneutic position represents the theory and practice of interpretation. Fundamentally, it is a philosophical stance that maintains that understanding is always interpretive, that, information is always filtered through our own experience, therefore, it's inherently interpreted. And also, just letting you know, this hermeneutic perspective, um, it means that like a hermeneutic approach to research is allowing for the researcher's perspective to be front and center and very explicit in the analysis of the data. So think about you as a listener, as a therapist. You are being you. You are being explicit about when you're interpreting, what you're thinking, and everything that you say. I would encourage you to consider it an offering, that the client can accept or reject, and then they do with it what they would like while you are metaphorically walking alongside them, or that, half step behind, allowing them to lead the conversation. Okay, so fundamentally, it is a philosophical stance that maintains that understanding is always interpretive, that there is no privileged standpoint for understanding. So your years of training in this doesn't privilege your standpoint, meaning that, or meaning and understanding, or wait, okay, there is no privileged standpoint for understanding, and that language and history are always both conditions and limits to understanding. Meaning and understanding are socially constructed by persons in conversation in language with one another. Thus, human action takes place in a reality of understanding that is created through social constructionism and dialogue. These socially constructed narrative realities give meaning and organization to one's experience. So you are a part of generating that knowledge and generating that understanding. Right. So not knowing refers to the attitude and belief that the therapist does not have access to privileged information. You can never fully understand another person and always need to learn more about what has been said or not said. Not knowing means the therapist is humble in what they know. A not knowing position does not mean the therapist does not know anything or that the therapist throws away or does not use what they already know. It does not mean the therapist just sits back and does nothing or cannot offer an opinion. Letting the client lead does not imply that the therapist is a blank screen, knows nothing, or does not use what they know. It does mean, however, that the therapist's contributions, whether they are questions, opinions, speculations, or suggestions, are presented in a manner that conveys a tentative posture and portrays respect for and openness to the other and to newness. So I'll have Dr. Anderson talk about that herself.
Okay, not knowing has been probably the most controversial thing that Harry and I ever wrote about, or that I continue to write about. And one of the most misunderstood concepts. And I say misunderstood in the sense of missed, MISSED hyphen, understood. In other words, that people had developed different understandings of it than we had as we began developing the concept, the idea. And so Lynn, in one interview, I think you were there, she says, "Well, where did it come from?" And it really came from students asking us after a family had left or a client had left, "Well, what did you really think? What's your judgment? What do you think is really going on between the mother and the father? What did you think about the way the mother put her hand on the son's knee?" And we would just simply say, "We don't know," or "I don't know." That these are questions you shouldn't be asking us. But if these are curiosities you have, you should be asking the family members. They're the important ones. And when people began becoming interested in the Milan idea of hypothesizing, which we really never did because it didn't fit with our work, because we were always interested in the expertise of the client. But then they would say, "What is your hypothesis?" And they would say, "Well, we don't have a hypothesis." We said, if you think in terms of hypotheses, we're much more interested in what the mother's hypothesis is, the father's hypothesis, the son's hypothesis. We're interested in the family member's hypotheses, and each member's. There's no one hypothesis for a family, and that it certainly would not come from us. So we would say we don't know, as a way of emphasizing. Again, there would be discussions about, "Well, do you think we should do this when next time we meet the family? Do you think we should do this?" And I said, "Well, these are things you can consider, but when the family comes in, why don't you say, after you left, we had this conversation. You talked about you, and we had some ideas about today. We don't know where you are today and what you're occupied by and how you might like to spend the time, but maybe we share our ideas with you." And Chris, amazingly, I would say 9 out of 10 times, the learners on our teams had forgotten these very critical hypotheses, these very important questions, these very important pieces of information. And we would always say, you don't have to know, because what happens when you think you know, you prematurely begin assuming and filling in the blanks, and you interrupt the client's story, the client's multiple stories that they will be telling you, and you can inadvertently steer a conversation. Another idea that we got from Bateson: be careful not to steer a conversation. That you can inadvertently steer a conversation in a direction that a client might not have taken it. And that you can also be seduced by one word or one thing a client has said and decide, this is, I think Lynn used to use the word, this is the meat, something like that, the stinky or smelly meat. And you can be so captivated by that your nose is drawn to that, and you miss all these other things. So we begin saying, we don't know what's important for the family or the client to talk about. And we certainly don't know how they should be telling their story, or because people don't tell stories. We don't talk with each other in orderly fashions, chronological order, or in those kinds of structured ways. And sometimes we talk fast, sometimes we talk slow. Sometimes one person speaks a lot, sometimes one person speaks a little, and we don't make judgments about that. In other words, we want people to present themselves the way they prefer to present themselves, and we want to be able to respond to that with that, and be able, as Tom and Anna Margrethe would say, walk alongside or walk along with them, rather than trying to lead or guide them in terms of the storytelling process or the storytelling content. One of the things that often happens is that when a concept sort of emerges, like not knowing, or like hypothesizing, or like reflecting teams, that people begin to take them and turn them into techniques or strategies. So the one thing that I want to emphasize with not knowing is that it's not a technique, it's not a strategy, it's not something that you do to for or about another person. It's not something that you just sort of a coat you put on and then walk into the room with that on. But that not knowing is a concept, and primarily it has to do with how one thinks about knowledge and the construction and the creation of knowledge. And of course, my bias has to do with the communal, the relational creation of knowledge, and that it's not something out there like you go on an archaeological dig and find and discover, or that you can give to another person, put into another person's head. So first of all, it has to do with how one conceptualizes knowledge. And then secondly, it has to do with the intent with which you offer your knowledge to another person. So Harry and I would say, and we've written about, and I continue to write about, that anything that I think I might know, I want to offer in a tentative or provisional manner. I don't want to offer it with the intent of, this is something that I think would be helpful to you. This is something that will give you insight. This is the way you should handle your child, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That I want to offer it as, this is a possible way to talk about, to think about what we've been talking about, what we've been focusing on. It's an option, it's a possibility. And thirdly, I think that when we offer what it is, what we think we might know, that we want to do that not only in a tentative or provisional manner, but we want to pay attention to the attitude, the tone, and particularly the timing with which we offer. First of all, I found, and also heard this from learners, that you can think, oh, you really want to say this, or you really want to ask about this, but there's not an entry right into the conversation. And then, just like I was saying a moment ago, then all of a sudden it's not important. The conversation's gone in another direction. That has faded into the background. Something else has come more into the foreground. If it's something that has lingered or stayed with you, then if there's a pause, of course you can offer it. And I think it might be important to offer it for a couple of reasons. Number one, that if you continue to be occupied by a particular question, a particular idea, a particular description or interpretation of another person or what they're doing or saying, then everything you see can tend to sometimes confirm that. In other words, you participate creating the person sitting in front of you. Your questions are often filtered by those ideas. So I find that if you're more open with it and you share it, then it's out there and be questioned. And also, even the process of sharing it, it begins to sometimes transform into something else because you never say exactly what you're thinking. So I get real excited when I'm talking about this, if you can tell, speed up and have lots of things I want to say. But I think the main thing I want to say is that not knowing is a concept. And it's not something that stands alone. It's part of what I call in my writing and my teachings a philosophical stance. It's a philosophy, a way of being with another person in the world, talking with them, responding with them, singing with them, looking with them, sighing with them, etc.
All right, turning my video back on here. Oops, so I went too far. All right, so again, just to wrap up here, the not knowing stance is it refers to the way the therapist thinks about and positions themselves with their knowledge and expertise. That is, therapists offer their voice, including previous knowledge, questions, comments, and opinions, and suggestions as food for thought and dialogue. So again, everything's an offering, everything's tentative. You, as therapists, remain willing and able to have your knowledge, including professional and personal values and biases, questioned, ignored, and changed. So, this is again that transformative piece that therapists also walk away changed. Not knowing can be misunderstood as a therapist knowing nothing, pretending ignorance, or forgetting that what they have learned. Instead, it simply refers to how therapists position themselves with their knowledge, including the timing and the intent with which knowledge is introduced. So again, tentative offering. The client is the expert is another stance in this, although sometimes misunderstood to mean the therapist has no opinion and no role in the process whatsoever. The concept of client as expert helps focus the therapist's attention on sincerely valuing the client's thoughts, ideas, and opinions about their lives. So clients are viewed as being the expert on their lives because therapists ultimately have very limited information about the fullness and complexity of clients' lives, whereas clients have a more complete history and insider perspective that therapists can never acquire to the same degree. So that hopefully that will, the story that I shared with you about the couples therapist will resonate here. So how does a collaborative language systems therapist conceptualize clinical problems? A collaborative therapist takes the position that there is no such thing as an objective problem. So the problems are relative, problems are subjective, problems are about perspective. Problems are a form of co-evolved meaning that exist in ongoing communication among others and selves. So problems are also co-constructed. Through our interpretations, we attribute meaning to others, events, actions, and ourselves. So you can see like a little bit of the flares of CBT here. Again, CBT came before all of these approaches. So how the attribution, the meaning that we make, the interpretation that we have about others, events, actions, and ourselves is formative in our view of the world and of problems. Problems cannot be separated from the observer's conceptualization. So that's why you are so curious about their perspective and what's going on for them, because in some ways you're trying to relieve some of the problem by allowing the client to really comprehensively talk about their perspective and their conceptualization of it. Problems are considered part of everyday living. They are not considered the product of pathological individuals or dysfunctional families. Problems just are, they exist. What is problematic to one person or family may not be problematic to another. Each problem is conceived as a unique set of events or experiences that has meaning only in the context of the social exchange in which it happened. Problems can be perpetuated and escalated through conversational breakdowns, failure to maintain generative conversation. So, a generative conversation is a way of talking and interacting that breaks ground for new action, revealing new knowledge which cannot be attained individually. So, structure of therapy, some 6 stages of it. All of this is underpinned by spontaneous, determined by moment to moment exchanges. So there again, there's not this formal approach to or process to follow in this approach. You're making moment by moment decisions. The therapist initiates an internal dialogical space, so you're very aware as a therapist of what's going on in your head. The therapist engages in an external dialogue with the client. So, you're talking with them. You're also, sharing what's going on in your head without, taking up too much space, and everything should be clinically relevant. The same time, the client is engaging in an internal dialogue. So they've got their thoughts and all the stuff going on, and then they engage in an external dialogue with one another if more than one client is in the room, and then the client engages in internal and external dialogue outside of therapy. So the way that you present, that you model in the therapeutic space, is hopefully to be replicated by the client. So in many instances, and this is so true in the work that I do, we don't share. Like, my clients really struggle to share what's going on with them, and they don't let other people in. So then they struggle with connection, with intimacy, with safety, in many ways, because they're not allowing those who are important to them to really know what's going on in them. So also at the same time, you are engaging in internal and external dialogue outside of therapy. You are embracing the approach that you are using in therapy. And I encourage all of you to, be more assertive in sharing what is going on with you. I think it's just good practice. Of course, I believe in this approach, so I'm sure I'm biased in that way. But I think it's a really good way to allow people into your process and to get to know you a little bit better. And it builds intimacy and connection. All right, so assessment is done through co-assessment. Although collaborative therapists seldom find traditional notions of diagnosis and assessment useful, they acknowledge that they and their clients live and work in systems in which these are important. If you use insurance, this is you can't get away from this. Traditional notions of diagnosis and assessment are based on the idea of objective reality, commonality across problems, and linear cause and effect. So just an underlying issue with DSM. Inherent in the notion of assessment is a determination of what is. A problem can be defined, its causes can be located, and it can be solved. But from a collaborative perspective, each observation, problem description, and understanding is unique to the people involved in their context, so it just doesn't fit. Problems are collaboratively explored and defined through conversation. Because conversation or dialogue is generative, a problem is never fixed, it's dynamic. It shifts as its definitions, meanings, and shapes change over time through conversation. So assessment is not separate so there's not an assessment phase in this approach. Assessment is not separate from the conversational process, and it involves exploring questions and curiosities to understand how the client constructs their understanding of the issues and potentials for moving forward. So language is seen as the primary mechanism of change, the primary vehicle in therapy. So transformation, for example, new knowledge, meanings, expertise, identities, agency, actions, and futures is inherent in the inventive and creative aspects of language and therefore dialogue. All dialogue or in dialogue, new meaning is under constant evolution and no problem will exist forever. In time, all problems will dissolve. This transformation, this is the theory of this approach. This transformative nature of language invites a view of human beings as resilient, and it invites an appreciation for each person's contributions and potentials. So next we'll talk about dialogical conversations. Talk in which participants engage with each other out loud and with themselves silently in words, signs, symbols, gestures, etc., in a mutual or shared inquiry. You are jointly responding. So, for example, you are commenting, examining, questioning, wondering, reflecting, nodding, gazing as they talk about the issue at hand. So, you're jointly responding as you're talking about the issue. Dialogical conversation is distinguished by shared inquiry. So you are asking questions, you're being curious. Shared inquiry is the mutual process in which participants are in a fluid mode and is characterized by people talking with each other as they seek to understand and generate meanings. And it is a in there together, two-way give and take, back and forth exchange. So this is where those offerings, like you are bringing yourself into this process because you are an important part of it. And what is going on with you is a part of the therapeutic process. Dialogical conversation begins with the therapist as a learner whose interest and curiosity about the client naturally invites the client into shared inquiry. So your curiosity is meant to invite curiosity from the client. This shift and the interpretive process of shared inquiry is the transformational process in collaborative language systems. So let's hear from Dr. Anderson.
So sometimes people ask, or often, particularly therapists who are new to these ideas will ask, well, if you don't know, then how do you know which questions to ask? Because most people are trained, and I certainly was early on trained from a psychodynamic perspective, that you come into the therapy room with your toolbox full of questions, either specific questions or type of questions. And certainly in the family therapy field, it's been very popular to have typologies of questions. And so we said, well, if we don't know, how in the world could we know what to ask another person before they start speaking and before they say something that we can be curious about? So Harry and I began to talk about and write about what we named conversational questions, not referring to a particular type or kind of question, but a question that's informed by the conversation itself, by the story that you're listening to. That if you really are trying to pay attention to the story a person's telling, you're really interested in learning about it, you listen to it differently and you ask different kinds of questions than you would if you think you know already the story to be told. And certainly if you think you know the story to be retold and what the more correct or proper or relevant or useful ending or resolution of the story. New ending, I should say. New beginning of the story she's looking at. So it's so not knowing has a lot to do with questions and what you're curious about. I would also think in terms of questions not being asked to be answered, but that questions are posed as a way of participating in the conversation. And how can your questions be close to the congruent with the responses that you're receiving from the other person? And how can you always pay careful attention to their responses to you?
All right. Let's go on to understanding from within the dialogue. So, conversational questions are questions that come naturally from within the dialogue rather than from professional theory. So you wouldn't be asking a theoretically specific question. You'd be asking a question based on what's already existing in the conversation. These questions follow logically from what the client is saying and are generated from your own curiosity and desire to understand more about what is being discussed right now. You ask these questions using the client's words and expressions, And these questions help both you and the client better understand the client's situation. So another piece of this approach, you want to avoid monologues and therapeutic impasses. So a monologue is defined as when each person tries to convince the other of their perspective and there's no mutual influences or exchange of ideas. I see this happening in like the couples work that I do a lot. A therapeutic impasse is when the conversation is no longer generating meanings or understandings. And it's your job as the therapist to ensure conversations in the room don't become dueling monologues. Um, yeah. So the goal of this approach is always to be generative. You are always wanting further meaning, more understanding, different perspectives. You want something new coming into the room. All right. So let's hear an example of Dr. Anderson's work in this.
My article in Family Process is about collaborative relationships and dialogic conversations. I want to introduce it to you by telling you about a consultation with a woman who had a long-standing, plaguing, distressing family conflict. She had inherited her deceased grandmother's role as the glue in the family who hosted all the holiday celebrations in her home. She felt a huge responsibility to carry on her grandmother's role and traditions. She sought consultation because an important Chinese family holiday was approaching. She dreaded the holiday because she did not want to continue the family ritual of a mandatory dinner, much less the mandatory family guest. She dearly loved her uncle but detested his wife, to put it mildly. She wanted to invite her uncle to dinner, but neither wanted to invite or not invite his wife, but didn't want her included. She felt a painful moral bind and unbearable decision dilemma. She was filled with guilt, anger, and frustration, and felt the situation was hopeless and unsolvable because, again, she neither wanted the wife at the dinner nor to dishonor her grandmother. I listened to her story, participated in its telling, engaging with her in a mutual inquiry, responding with interest and curiosity, posing questions, commenting, and so forth, actively trying to understand the situation from her perspective. Running through her story fragments about the family situation was her adamacy that she would not waver in her conviction that she would not, under any circumstances, do anything that might be or appear to be a conciliatory gesture toward her uncle's wife. Our conversation touched the edge of several options that she indicated in one way or another would not work. She asked me, "So what should I do?" I said, "Well, let me think out loud for a moment to see if I could come up with 2 or 3 possible ways that she might handle the situation that we could discuss, and perhaps some useful ideas would emerge from our talking about them." So I tentatively offered ideas that formed as I spoke. As we explored them, I paid careful attention to her responses and kept in mind that she wanted to continue her good relationship with her uncle and was not seeking an amiable relationship with his wife. She gave reasons why none, nor any variation, would work. All sounded like offering an olive branch to the uncle's wife and mending a relationship that she didn't want to mend. Neither was my intention. My ideas were offered for food, for thought, and dialogue, simply as ways to continue talking about her situation and exploring possible options. I did not think in any way that she was a difficult nor a negative person, but rather she knew her life and circumstances better than I could. She left our session without answers, but satisfied with our seemingly simple conversation, generously thanking me, saying it was very good to talk about her problem and that she felt she would be able to find a solution, but had no idea how or what it might be. Rather than a solution, to me, she seemed to have a sense of peace and a sense of a way forward. A month later, I received an unsolicited email from her. Her words: "It has been a month since we met. I've had dinner gathering with my uncle. I finally did not suggest to him whether to bring his wife to the dinner or not. I cannot explain why, but it seems that I suddenly realized this. It should be my uncle who decides whether to bring his wife with him, not me. He came alone to the dinner without anyone asking him to do so. I think I will not worry about this issue anymore, not because I trust my uncle will do the right thing, but I have changed from within. Now I feel like I can just let it be. I believe even if my aunt joins our gathering, I will still be able to handle the situation without problem. I really cannot figure out why my attitude changed, but I welcome this change. I think the interview you did with me was a turning point. Thank you very much. It was definitely enhanced this change. Several months later, I received another brief email from her. The Mid-Autumn Festival is approaching, and this is the second most important gathering for the Chinese. I will meet my uncle for a dinner without hesitation this time. Thanks again for the interview. The article you will read portrays the art and soul of collaborative therapy. In it, I describe the therapist's philosophical stance, which invites and encourages therapy as a spontaneous, non-formulaic, mutual occasion for client and therapist to join in a relational dialogical inquiry. Something new begins to emerge throughout the encounter, while at the same time informing it and continuing afterwards for each member. The inquiry is the space and process that becomes an adaptable and sustainable platform for transformative possibilities. Each conversation is a springboard for future ones and for clients to develop their own new meanings, understandings, actions, and ways forward that are unique and relevant to them and their lives. The woman's feedback in the story depicts one example of the emergent and unforeseen possibilities that can flow from a sustainable, generative relational space and dialogic process.
All right, let's keep moving here. So talking about positionalities, as we've talked about, this approach is a philosophical stance. So there's social constructionist viewing. The stance characterizes a way of thinking about, experiencing, being in relation with, and talking with, acting with, and responding with the people therapists meet in therapy. The therapist's focus is always on how clients construct meaning about the events in their lives. We are also conversational partners. A collaborative therapist and client become conversational partners as they engage in dialogical conversations and collaborative relationships. Dialogical conversation and collaborative relationship refer to the shared inquiry process in which people talk with each other rather than to each other. Inviting this kind of partnership requires that the client's story take center stage. It requires that the therapist constantly learn. You are listening and trying to understand the client from the client's perspective. So, a little bit more on positionalities is the concept of being public. So, from a collaborative stance, therapists are open to make their invisible thoughts visible. For instance, if a therapist has an idea or opinion, it is shared with the client, again, offered as food for thought and dialogue. Important are the manner, attitude, and timing in which therapists offer opinions, not whether they can or cannot share them. So it's always a possibility. You are being thoughtful in how and when you do this. Keeping therapists' thoughts public minimizes the risk of therapist and therapist client monologue, being occupied by one idea about a person or situation. Like Dr. Anderson was talking about, if it's something that's going to preoccupy you, say it, bring it out. If you have a theory about what's going on, if you have a thought, share it as an offering and then be able and willing to let it go if it doesn't resonate. Monologue can subsequently lead to a therapist participating in, creating, or maintaining external descriptions of clients, such as resistant or in denial. So it's important to be aware of the thoughts that are going on and to share them when it is relevant. So you're not writing the client's story for them. You're an outsider imposing your position on the client in that way. When this happens, whether being the therapist or the client or between any two people in the room, your job is to gently shift the conversation back to a dialogical exchange of ideas. So you'll see this happening, like I said, between couples, for example, or family members where they write the stories of their loved ones, making assumptions, imposing upon them. So it's your job to get them back into a space of this shared inquiry, this dialogical conversation, generative conversation. So we can achieve this by shifting back into a curious stance, asking to better understand the client's perspective or to inquire if there's a particular point that the client thinks the therapist is not fully understanding. So, in order to do this, another piece of this approach is using appropriately unusual comments. So, I'll give you examples of each of these. So, types of comments. So, too usual. So, these comments are so familiar or predictable that they don't add anything new. They often feel cliche, rehearsed, or surface level. So let's say the client says something like, I just feel stuck in this relationship. A too usual comment would be, relationships can be hard sometimes. And why it's too usual is that it echoes the obvious without creating movement or curiosity. Okay, then there's too unusual of comments. So these comments are so far outside the client's frame of reference that they risk confusion, alienation, or rupture. So let's say the client says something like, I feel like I can't get my partner to hear me. And then a too unusual comment would be, have you considered that this might be because you're channeling interdimensional ancestral energies? So it's too unusual because it introduces something irrelevant or disconnected from the client's lived reality, making it hard to engage with. An appropriately unusual comment, they are fresh enough to spark reflection while still resonating with the client's language, culture, and experience. They invite curiosity and possibility without overwhelming. So let's say the client says something like, I feel stuck in this relationship. A appropriately unusual comment is, when you say stuck, it makes me wonder, what would a little less stuck look like for you, even just for an afternoon? So it works because it reframes stuck into a spectrum, offering a new perspective that is surprising yet accessible. So it makes a difference because it enables therapists to offer clients reflections that make a difference, and it varies greatly with each client and therapeutic alliance, like what is a too usual, too unusual, or appropriately usual comment. And you are listening for the pause. So an appropriately unusual comment generally is responded to with a bit of a pause because you've sparked some thinking. So that's something that will give you some feedback about its appropriately unusualness. So you also are asking mutually puzzling questions and processes. You're inviting clients to be curious. You want to shift in clients. There's a shift in clients that is visible. Their body posture softens, their head may tilt to the side, they move more slowly or more quickly. This is, again, another indicator of those appropriately unusual comments or being in this mutually puzzling place. It's a two-way process of meaning making. So it occurs only when the therapists are successful in creating a two-way dialogical conversation. And it's a new distinction that is highlighted, and the client is invited to kick it around and see what, if any, new ideas emerge. So that's what is happening during these processes. Accessing multiple voices in writing. So clients may be asked to write the following: letters to themselves from aspects of themselves and or from newly formed, emerging, future, or past selves. Letters to themselves from significant others from the past, future, or present. Letters to and from significant others, dead or alive, speaking from a voice of perspective that was formerly kept private. Letters or journal entries to speak from parts of the self that are typically not expressed or emerging in therapy. So just, an option for you of tools to use in the room. So a sample treatment plan here: in the early phase, you're creating a collaborative relationship with the client by creating and maintaining a dialogical conversation. In the middle phase, this is based on what goals are set in the early phase, and the therapist and client will identify goals for the middle phase because treatment is open always to modification. Then in the later phases, you're addressing any new issues that have emerged that clients want to address. You also will want to invite anyone else who may need to be a part of the conversation. So a note here, CLS believes in a dialogical space, which means that they don't believe in the use of predetermined techniques or interventions. And the focus is on maintaining dialogical conversations that allow for the generation of new meanings and possibilities. So, as always, these approaches are not without their critiques. So, is this theory practical in a clinical setting? It's just a question. When a therapist has been trained to join with clients, they often adapt and empathize with clients, usually agreeing and validating their clients' experiences. With CLS, you're almost unlearning that process, where areas where you would be quick to agree, you might want to ask questions about. Therapist created limits are usually associated with slipping out of collaborative mode. This is very easy to do in session as our society is focused on solutions, fixing, and first order change. Then another question to consider, what about different population? What if the client is displaying psychotic features? What would you do? How would you apply CLS? All right. So with language, this theory can be hard in a lot of settings. So some more just like critiques or just, places to contemplate. This theory is hard in a lot of settings. We are assuming that our client will engage in dialogical conversation when they might not be in a place to do so. So maybe there's not that trust there. The language ability is not there. There's also power in what our clients do not say, the silence and the I don't knows. Being given permission not to share. So if all of your knowledge is generated through conversation, what if you're not generating conversation? So language is powerful. Language can come with privilege. It can be alienating, isolating, ostracizing. It could also be healing and comforting. So just recognizing the power of language. So one thing that is said is in time, all problems will dissolve. This transformative nature of language invites a view of human beings as resilient, and it invites an appreciation of each person's contributions and potentials. So all problems will dissolve. Is that true? Is that maybe a privileged position? And then resiliency, what does it mean to be resilient? So in some ways, just questioning some of the assumptions of this theory. Then lastly, lack of empirical evidence. This is going to be a pretty common theme in our approaches this semester. Collaborative therapists believe that one must ask the client to determine whether therapy is useful, and if so, how. Most evidence of the effectiveness of CLS is anecdotal. Clients and therapist stories about their experiences of therapy and the usefulness of the approaches for them. That's not considered empirical evidence. Qualitative research includes studies of the effectiveness of collaborative therapy, and analysis of whether therapist behaviors and attitudes were consistent in their therapy philosophy and the application of the ideas in supervision and education. I mean, as you can see, the research that has been done is pretty old. And that's all I have for you, y'all.